Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and we have guests today, Chris Carl and Meredith Foster, a couple interested in Heartland Pathways. So we also have guests Ray and Jason. They are here to record for WEFT a track that will go to independent media as a promo for WEFT. And this is sort of an experimental first, I think. We're without David this morning, so that means that I'm running the board, which is a little bit risky, but that's okay. One of the things that I want to deal with is a follow-through from last week's program, where we had Kevin Elliott and Sandra Ogden on to discuss the rail trail between St. Louis and Kansas City. It's a 200-mile long trail, and this is one of about 1,500 trails within the U.S. that exist mainly because the federal government was afraid that they were deregulating too many railroad lines, abandoning too many railroad lines that they may need in the future. And it's turning out to be so. The railroad traffic is high and is being reformed, and some of the changes are massive, but you have to compare with CSX running 1 ton of freight, 1 gallon of gas, 500 miles, with a semi-trailer or a garbage truck running 3, 4, 5, 6 miles a gallon to the landfill 35-mile way. So those railroads are beginning to take off interstate traffic, especially semis, and that will perhaps in the long run mean that some of the trails that have replaced rails as an interim trail use may come back into reuse. The disappointment, floating fact at the moment for railroads, is that these trails have become tremendously popular, and it takes a while, but it means that when the railroads may have to take over a trail, it gets to be a public problem. So this week I went to the Audubon board meeting, and I was asking for funds for prairie work, but I also wanted to alert them to the fact that we have 33 miles of railroad bed, and so basically about 100 feet wide. That means about 330, 350 acres of ground. Not the world's greatest because it's had a railroad line on it, and it has some of the contaminants of railroad ties, creosote, clinker out of engines, so there's high in sulfur. So the piece that is in the middle, which is the ballast, is a little scungy. But the rest of the 100 feet is good for biodiversity, which is a major concern of Heartland Pathways as a charitable trust agency within the state. One of the first questions of me at the board meeting was, what is Heartland Pathways and what does it do? And this means that we need to go to a different era. We need to set up change, and it's a tremendous task. Let me give you an idea of the enormity of the task. On Friday I went to a railroad engineering seminar, and the person debating the issue was discussing railroads in Europe and their reform. They're under the jurisdiction of many different countries, and the efficiency as a result is not very good. So if you're a sculptor of society, how do you move into Europe with different language barriers, with different cultural backgrounds, and suggest that you make change? That's kind of traumatic, because there's tradition there, and every railroad had its own tradition. Now, when we come back home, we have to look at our own territory, the Midwest, for instance, and we have to look at our own heartland pathways. And the question is, how do we achieve change? Well, first of all, let's assure you that change does occur. In the last couple of weeks, there's been a plethora of information about change that occurred in the latter part of the 1960s into the 70s. It's when Martin Luther King passed, was assassinated. It includes a lot of change that was kind of dramatic. So my point is that change can occur. That means that you have to look at the state of Illinois and look at the potential for a rail trail. A wonderful thing, but for those who are adjacent, it's something that requires getting over the fact that some adjacent owners would like to own the bed. We don't have any demonstration places. So going back to the 70s, the early 70s, we had two major problems. One was that we had a Vietnam War, and we also had an institution that had almost no black citizens present as students. I think when I came here in the early 60s, there were 8 black male students, and most of them were sport-oriented people. As I remember, you have to remember that we're in generalities here, and so I would add the proviso that this is WEFT, and we not the statements made by myself and others, not those of the station, but those of ourselves. So we had low involvement with African American community people, but we had a war with a high involvement of African American people, and that was a problem for the black community because it was hard to get other jobs. It was hard to have the education necessary to have sophisticated jobs. The Caucasian community, on the other hand, was very concerned about the war itself. I can remember walking out the front door of my office, which was near University High School at the time, and there were just busloads and rows of National Guard people standing about 2 feet apart because the university was being challenged, because it was having the Army use its resources. That caused a lot of concern about the Caucasian, from the Caucasian community. And so we have these two separate things going on. The university itself had a responsibility for crowd control and for the control of protesters. Some of it was pretty stringent, and but at that time it was decided to have a Project 500, where you brought 500 African American and Latino students in to participate in the education that was provided by the university. These students were not uneducated. They were the cream of the crop of their specialized high schools, which were normally mainly black or Latino oriented at the time. So we had very interesting students, but they were a little cautious. Whereas the Caucasian community would like to support and encourage these people, it wasn't easy. The Caucasian crowd was not necessarily felt to be responsible here. So there was a standoff, and many people who tried to involve themselves in black-white associations didn't get to do that. At the same time, there was a culture of let's do it ourselves. So they formed restaurants and garages and all sorts of agencies that allowed for alternate thought, almost labeled as hippie, but not quite a flower child involvement, but very serious. And the university was, although it was their responsibility to control these alternate thinkers, it was also tacitly interested in allowing freedom of speech and sort of calming the situation some. So just a few weeks ago we had to say goodbye to Dan Perino. But Dan Perino, one of his responsibilities was to establish music. And so he established the Medicare 6, 7, 8, and 9, and part of the responsibility of that organization was to provide music that would be a calming element. So we have a history where change is imminent. In the long run, these groups like the Red Herring encouraged a lot of this. The Unitarian Church, those of us who've been through it knew these groups and where they were. There were some inclusions of drugs and other things that LSD, for instance, allowed people to think slightly differently, and that was exciting. But it could be overused. Now, but gradually the war situation changed, and those groups morphed into the university. So people who were out there on the street eventually were in the establishment of the university, and they did make change, and they're still making change. And so I want to say, have confidence. We can make change. Now, that having been said and establishing a little history, what do we do with a resource that is 30 miles long, that is Heartland Pathways, that is being challenged by farmers at the moment, who are basically being tremendously good? They have kept our trail alive for 25 years. And it's only recently, as the price of land has gone up, and it's very, very difficult to sit there with a bunch of prairie weeds and not take them over. This is ice cream. This is the land that in some cases is going up to $12,000 an acre. Now, we don't have land that's worth $12,000 an acre. We have the old railroad bed, we have the gravel and the sort of whatever else. But trees have grown on these corridors, and that has made them interesting to the people who are in the little communities that the trail goes through. But all of a sudden we have a challenge of our contiguity of a trail. And the contiguity just doesn't include our 33 miles. It includes the adjacent 24 miles to Danville from Urbana. Now, how do we go about changing or challenging this situation? It's in a way, it's an ideal challenge for us, because we have gone through the era when if we would try to put in a trail 25 years ago, we would not have been successful. But we've gradually done interesting things, like we've put in a trail. Monticello has bought an easement in, near to them that goes across the Sangamon on one of our truss bridges. That's a positive. And the two people that I have here, Chris and Meredith, have been looking at. They've been generous enough to be one of the few people who have gone around and looked at the territory. So, in a way, they're artists and sculptors. And how do you challenge them to do more than art and sculpture? How does this art and sculpture fit in? So this is where I want to ask you, how do you think in terms of this, the region, including something like the Katy Trail? How do you think about Chicago, where there's a lot of trails because there's political clout and money and the soils aren't so good? How do you look at East Central Illinois and do something with this? Well, in the long run, when you fund it, this is a multi-million-dollar project, and it's worthwhile to the community. But the community doesn't know about it. So the first thing we need is a prospectus that says what we're doing. Then we need to add people like Chris and Meredith onto here to do what they can do. So one of the things I wanted to do this morning was to ask Chris and Meredith, how do they think that they can fit into this change? There's a temptation to be an artist, but artists also have to fit into the milieu of the world around them. And so how do we do this? And I'll let you say something now, and give me your reactions, and then I might back off and have a few more words.
Thanks, David. I think you're talking about the project being a really large project, and it is, and it fits in at a regional scale as well as a local scale. But I feel like there has to be, in order to make it manageable, we have to look at the local scale also. Like, what can we do actively? What can we do right now?
Yes, tremendous.
You know? So, and that's a good place to start. So that we're not overwhelmed by the scale of the project of 33 miles and beyond in a regional scale.
Well, go back to the Indigo Gallery that you have an exhibit in at the moment. Meredith, you have sculpted with charcoal.
Mm-hmm. Ash and charcoal, yes.
So you got to turn your microphone on.
It's not on.
Okay.
Right in there, sorry. Yes, so I made an installation that was in the downstairs of Indigo Gallery, and it was comprised of sifted ash and charcoal. And this doesn't necessarily tie in directly with what you were just asking us about implementing a plan.
Oh yes, it does. It's like what Chris was saying. These are the little elements put together.
Right, but the reality is who actually goes to most gallery openings. It's sort of preaching to the choir.
Yes.
And therefore, I'm not necessarily thinking about gallery exhibitions as a way to be able to do something that you were exactly talking about. But back to the actual piece for a moment. It was a piece that was installed in the downstairs, and like I said, it was made of sifted ash and charcoal. And where the ash and charcoal came from was from your properties, or Heartland Pathways properties, and is basically an amalgam of autumn olive and bush honeysuckle.
And you've helped remove the autumn olive,
Correct.
which is an invasive weed tree, and you helped to burn the territory, which was desperately needed by the prairie.
Right. So that's what it's made from. It does also have some native plant material in it as well, like the black cherry that's out there. Also some pawpaw that didn't come from your properties, actually came from my parents in southern Illinois,
Yes.
because they, on their property, pawpaw is very, very dominant. So anyway, the ash and charcoal is made from that. And basically, the reason why I chose to make ash and charcoal, or how it came about, was that I think it was last January that we were working on your properties. We were removing lots of autumn olive, and I was really attracted to the way that it would stack and it would become a hedge, and it made me wonder how should I use this material? How could I make use of this in some way for my own work? And I didn't really want to use branches. I didn't want it to look overly natural in quotation marks, and so I began to reconstitute it in the form of ash and charcoal, which is a long process in itself. And then I used that as basically a drawing material. Not drawing in the sense of making a mark the way that we normally think, but I sift it into these large scale drawings.
Three-dimensional.
Yeah, or I always call it
light
turning it
across
around.
it, and you could see the shadows of the imaginary mountains and rivers and
Right.
there.
Right.
I think that's the interesting part about, an artist's role in some way, as an explorer, as someone, as a group of people, or a particular type of a point of view where you're out there looking at material and you're looking at a place. But to kind of answer your question about, how does art fit in a larger role, there's something about artists have specific skills that are many times not really applicable to current kind of technology or something. They have specific skills and energies that I think would be useful to kind of harness. And there's a willingness in some way to entertain ideas which are large and impossible. So, for instance, when we did the project this summer, the Interurban project, we had 4 people come from, artists with specific skills, and they had a tremendous amount of ability. And there's a lot of people like that are coming out of schools and universities that are, getting into, what do they do with that in a way, except pursue, a career in art. But if you can harness that energy in a way, let's say at Heartland Pathways, and create an opportunity for people to come in and do interesting things, but at the same time, be maintaining these rights of ways, creating a trail, creating a kind of public, almost like a spectacle in a way, to draw attention to it, to show people that, hey, there's something to look at here.
So let me reintroduce you. Meredith has a master's degree in art, to realize that this is an artist. And Chris is doing a master's degree in landscape architecture, and he's an artist with a landscape more. So these are the elements that I think are interesting that you bring together. Meredith is teaching at the Urbana Adult Education.
Yeah.
And so you're encountering a group of people that sometimes are children, sometimes are adults, and you're talking to people. And Chris, you're doing the same. I will probably want to take you to Weldon for a city meeting shortly, because Chris has been taking stumps and markers, concrete markers, fence markers and the like, from an area that had the trees dug up. And we want to say to this community that over and over, these trails have upgraded the communities so that they have a motel, so that they have a store, so that they have restaurants, and it takes about 15 years. It's a slow process, but we're at the point where I've been very involved, but I'm getting older and we have to transfer to a younger generation. And how do we do that? One of the things that I think is absolutely important is that we have documentation of the resource, so that we can tell people at the state level, at the federal level, what we have. It might be a 30-page event with details. Not everyone wants the details. We have a number of people who believe in what we're doing and they don't need to be told anything. But there are other people who need a 3-page a one-page folder. Pictures are very helpful because we can't get people to go 27 miles to have a look at a field that's been dug up for corn and is being harvested for corn at the present time. So the first thing is documentation. The next thing is to have a group within the community that is a leadership group. And that might not necessarily be yourselves, but it might be the person who is a community activist. It might be someone who's retired from a park district or an engineering firm. It need not necessarily be a lot of people, but those people have to put together a comprehensive plan or a feasibility study. Do we really want something like this? How do we manage the challenges? In the Katy Trail, one person had a swine farm on either side of the railroad line, and she did not want this trail. So that can hold you up, and if you don't have adjacent roads, you can't get around that spot. So there are challenges. So we need a retinue of people, probably no more than about 6 or 7 people who can get together and say, we think this is a genuine situation where we need to go ahead. In the Katy Trail, they had someone who also financed this. At the moment, we desperately need seed money in order to even put up pictures on the computer. We need web pages and sophistication we don't necessarily have. So I'm looking for the people who are baby boomers who are now retiring, who are going around for a while and have skills, but I'm also looking for the 26-year-olds, the 13-year-olds, and the 5-year-olds that will come and do this sort of thing.
It's a challenge here in this city because it's 40,000 people come and go every year, and there's a lot of intelligent, bright people who are educated, but whenever they're finished with their degrees, then they're going to leave. So how do we set up a situation where we can, maybe one of two things: convince people to stay for one reason or another,
you
or
don't have to convince
utilize their skills while they're here. Make it possible for them to contribute in the small amount of time that they're here.
There are 8 degrees of us that have stayed around. Champaign-Urbana is full of people who have come and they like the argument, the situation. It's in the middle of flatland. There's no mountains, no interesting things, but we've got people, and they do stay. And you were going to say something.
Oh, well, actually, I wasn't, but.
Oh, okay.
Off
Sorry.
road, but.
That's what we're after at the moment. So we have to let people know what Heartland Pathways is and how can we raise money. There's another thing. In Katy Trail, they had one guy named Jones who thought it was a good idea, and he put down a lot of money. So that was, and also the railroad was running along the bottomlands, and it was flooded fairly regularly. So the resource for the railroad was not as good as it could be. So they would choose a railroad that went through on the upland rather than that. And it's fairly simple to put a trail on a railroad bed because the bed is already there and the bridges are there. And that's what the interim trail use agreement did. It quieted the trails, it saved the bridges, and it gave enhancement money. But beyond that, we need this retinue of people who realize there is a resource out there and it can be used. So then we need to hire, if necessary, people who are community development people. So you're seeing behind us people who are from independent media who are recording what we're saying, and they're taking the message to other people. So eventually we need 1,000 or 2,000 people who know about the trail and know examples and know the features that are interesting. You were taking a sculpted piece. Say something about taking a sculpted piece to an elevator, historic elevator. Just remind us of how your artwork fits into a temple.
Well, for that, It was just about creating a spectacle in a way, and just, you know, activating what's considered a marginal space. You know, the spaces, you know, the Heartland Pathways essentially, you know, and all those types of marginal areas there we see them as a blur. We don't really think of them very much, but they are. It's not. There's not like a huge, you know, topographical feature like a mountain or something that just draws your attention right in. It's all about details. It's about the small things. It looks just like a blur, a monolithic blur of green. When you get in there and you start looking close, it's interesting. So I think that the projects, you know, the artworks and stuff, are interested in that, are interested in looking closely at that sort of thing and create, you know, trying to uncover the cultural material, the layers of history, the layers of ecology. Why is it that these places, how have these places come to be? You know, it's all through our landscape here is all completely a constructed landscape at this point. And these small little narrow regions, I mean, that's all the corridor we have. As in terms of continuity, it's about habitat continuity, it's about like a historical continuity, so on and so forth. I think, you know, one of the things that I think is useful from a landscape architect perspective, and, you know, that an artist can learn from is that a lot of times out of the academy or something, artists we're trying to create works on, you know, you're trying to create your own work. What is it that you do? But in the landscape architecture world, you know, it's more about teamwork. It's about not one singular person, not a singular person's idea, but it's about like a studio or a firm or a group of people that are working together for an idea. It's not, and so I think that that's really useful. In what?
There's a serious need, though, for you as a student to have a theoretical background of how this fits in. So I'm looking to you to go to the Katy Trail, find out how it was developed, to relate to the rail trail movement in Washington, to get an overall thing. I think that's satisfying to the university because it needs that sort of theoretical base, but you have a practical base. And I want to see the practical base like a cloud up there with people in it and a relationship to other states, other countries, and it has a cultural element. That old elevator has a character. Can we use it as a feature? Can you put your sculpted piece there and take your artistic element out, and with a crane that we've had sitting around, you're looking at resources and saying, we can do this or that, and we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity there in terms of that. I mean, like I was saying, we look at that as kind of like these marginal areas as kind of a blur. It's nothing. It's just weeds or something. But I mean, really, if you know, historical preservation, maintenance, or something like that is usually revolves around something famous, something super important. But
it has to have clout and it has to make money.
But now
I think looking for something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think these places actually, we can begin to look at them like that. Like that elevator out there is part of our cultural history. The train, the crane, the wood, the succession of plant material out there is our cultural history in a way.
Well, Meredith put together a very nice little element on burning. A lot of people don't understand that most land-based biology is dependent on burning. The country is between two oceans, and you get a rambunctiousness of the clouds creating electricity and then shorting to the ground and creating fires. And if you don't burn, the plants have spent 10,000 years since glaciers retreated. They've come back in, but they've always been associated with fire. So settlers come in quite later, and they don't want fire. So they go to the woods and they make sure they're not going to be burned, and then, crazily enough, after years, there's a huge fire, and they lose the resources that they want. Even the prairie can't stand huge fires. It was a modest fire every so often. And Meredith, you were asking me about seed, and just to take a microscope and look at the seed and create a diagram. You've also done something which is rather wonderful from my point of view. is that you've done projects, both of you, and you've reported on them and submitted them to Arts Council sort of people. And that is tremendously difficult for artists to do. They don't always finish the job. They've presented their sculpted piece, but then that's where it stops. And so the Arts Council, for instance, is often wanting to encourage people to report and to publish and to put it on YouTube or on the web. So just on Thursday we got GoDaddy up, and we're in better shape to put a web page in and be able to administer ourselves, not be dependent on administrators that are in New York or New Mexico. The technology has changed. That's the same for the people in Europe. They don't only have a problem of trains in different states and countries, but they have a problem that the technology is not there yet. Do you do this by satellite? Do you do this by having an establishment that can broadcast? If so, does the tree get in the way? How do you do this? How do you work with the person who has to maintain the railroad bed? So we have to go to Lodge just recently, where there were 90 people, 60 of them working 20 vehicles, reforming the railroad at a walking pace. So one vehicle takes the pins out, the next vehicle lifts the railroad up so that you can take the plate out, the next one takes the lousy tie out, and the next one comes along and drops picks up the lousy one and drops a new one. The next one does the reverse, and within walking pace you have a reformed railroad bed, and you have a train going through at 70 miles an hour. That's the technology, but that's the little guy that's pulling out the plate. And then we have to look to see that they, in order to do this, the herbicide is a line. And so there's a huge swath of our only prairie going. So how do we work with engineers?
We do the same thing. We create a fleet of instruments and tools that do at a walking pace, like you're explaining. The same thing for conservation as they do for the same thing for conservation and trail making that the railroad engineers do to relay this rail.
So I'm thinking of going to the railroad engineering seminar with algorithms about how you put down your prairie or keep your prairie. So they don't have biology, they don't have sociology. How do we suggest in a very mild-mannered way that our engineers should look at that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way for me, the best way I learn, whenever someone tells me that I should do something, I definitely won't do it. But whenever, but if someone's leading by example, it's just the simplest thing. So I feel like, that's our role. That's our as artists and culture makers to do that sort of thing, to try to lead by example, to try to be on the ground and do things like that. So instead of saying, you need to pay attention to these cultural things, and we're just incorporating them.
So one reason why I'm at the seminar is to know the language, so I can talk to people.
Yeah.
And even though I don't understand all those algorithms and mathematical models, but we need diagrams. I can understand diagrams. Mm-hmm. Who's doing what, and if we need 6 people, does the board become a working board? Or does the board be a theoretical board? And do we have a group of associates that can come along with high hose and backhoes and tractors and engineers and do something? So we also need a manager, a CEO that controls, that goes to the board with ideas. So the associates come in with ideas and they present them to the board. But then you find out that the board has no power because it doesn't have a tax base. And so then you're totally dependent on going to the recreators on either end of your trail. And do the recreators have power? Yes, for recreation. So you don't have that multiple input that you would like. So over in Clinton, where we have 5 miles that joins 2 state parks, there's a need for a park district to link that corridor to Clinton. But the county board doesn't want to do that because a park district is responsible enough that it requires tax base. They don't want the extra tax base. So this is not simple stuff, folks. This is complex, and we have to be very careful not to dump on people like yourselves that have a already established idea of what they're doing.
Yeah, I think, like we were saying, it's a question of scale. So on a local level, we can do things every day, that kind of bring light to the situation. But on a larger scale, like a regional scale or a state scale or, like national scale, I mean, like Minnesota has a 1% tax that people in the city agreed to pay for clean air, clean water, and culture. And that creates a boom there in Minneapolis, and in that state for artists and interesting projects to happen. If we had something like that here, and Illinois, then we could really get a lot of this kind of conservation stuff going on, a lot of artworks going on, mobilize that energy, mobilize that that creative force,
I'm
to do something.
Australian in background, and the Australian per capita involvement in the environment is greater than the per capita involvement in the environment here. So we can afford to ask, and many of the people that we would ask are wanting to be asked. We just have to reach them, and it's our fault if we don't get them. It was our fault that the original adjacent owner to the land that's being dug up at Weldon was with us and understood why we wanted biodiversity. When he passed, other members of the family looked at that territory quite genuinely and said, we own this, we're going to do corn and soybeans. And you have to say now, okay, you folk probably have agriculture degrees, but you have agriculture degrees that are earning money and power that way. We want you to think about the biodiversity and need for the biochemicals that are in those plants. So you walk to the next door piece of land that's on the contiguous piece of railroad, and you see the silphiums and the indicator plants that say, this soil is original prairie. So somehow I have to get to the farmer involved and say, genuinely, we're doing things here for the agricultural landscape. In 1936, you did not have soybeans. You sent your agronomists around the world to pick up glycine, which is soybean botanical name. And so the U of I, the University of Illinois, has the biggest and bestest collection of soybean seed, and some of that they will reproduce every so often. Sometimes they will store it as seed. So by 1936, they had enough reading, perhaps 50 or more people involved in research, that they had soybeans, and they've been doing research ever since. If we as US people are willing to do that in other countries, we have to be prepared to have saved some of our territory so the rest of the world can come to us and find a medical, biochemical or something that other people will use elsewhere. We have a responsibility to the world to not totally dig up the prairie.
And that's where Heartland Pathways becomes really, important. It's not that it's, because in the midst of this agricultural landscape, which is completely transformed, these are the only things that exist. We've erased a lot of the water channels. We've erased, so there's these thinnest of margins exist all throughout the state, and Midwest for that matter. Anywhere that there's, a huge agriculture, breadbasket kind of corn belt thing going on. I mean, those things to me become, and a lot of people, have done this work in the past too, but they become the best opportunity for conservation. The question becomes, what are we trying to conserve? Mm-hmm. What is it exactly? What are we trying to conserve? Because we're trying to conserve a diversity of things, right? There's prairie, there's forest, there's something new which we don't really understand yet, which is a succession that's happening now that's both challenging some of.
It's not the same as it was in 1850.
Yeah. So how do we deal with that? How do we make choices, and based on that kind of thinking, where there are all these things happening at once, and sometimes they don't all go together. So if you have a prairie situation, but you have this new succession of urban plants, what do we do? How do we make the decision of what to keep and what to get rid of? And not only that, it's a continuous thing. It never ends, as you know.
Chris is concerned about replanting some of this prairie, and that's restoration of a different cat than trying to preserve the original. So Heartland Pathways has been mainly concerned about capturing little pieces of the original before it's taken out. If we put in a fast track between Chicago and Champaign, so the academics can get to the University of Chicago within a couple of hours and talk to each other, that will take out a huge amount of our only remaining prairie. So we have to talk to railroaders. So talking to a steam engine is part of the process. Talking to Audubon is part of the process. I have some things that I think I'll put on the back sheet here that reminded me that things happen fairly regularly. Well, I think we've probably covered most of them. I go to a little event on Oregon Street where people of all ages come together for a supper on Tuesday night. And it's quite fantastic because those people talk to each other and they support each other, and they go pick seed, or they work with Common Ground. Common Ground, its name came from that era of the 70s where they were setting up different sorts of restaurants. And so they have made inroads at the moment, and they've kept the name. It goes back to that era. And today at 4 or 4:30, I think it is, the Common Ground will be having a board meeting. They're expanding. They're having teaching opportunities. So and Chris knows and Meredith knows very well too. The Common Ground gave us an opportunity to stand outside, and people who had changed, like if they were 55 cents, the other 45 cents went to the project. We got $500 out of that. So these are things we think about and encourage. It's important to do it at that level, whether it's in a church or making wood for a fire, or just talking to people. So there's this strange sort of magma where you can't put a finger on whether you've made a publication in Nature. You're talking to the people who come in from Angkor, and they are amazed that you know where Angkor is in the first place. And then you have to explain that this was a railroad line that was docked off at either end when Van was there. It was nearly lost out to the Grange people on that line. They got $4 million from the state to save that line. The landscape architects got really enthused. They were going to put high railers on this 50 or 60 mile line and interpret the landscape. But it came into problems of having to cross major lines and things like that. So it never happened. But it's an idea that's there, and it might be something that you guys might actually get into. So go and see the woman at the library who was standing outside looking at the little prairie, and talk to her and talk to her husband or her significant other who plays music. And music has had a tremendous influence. The whole cleaning up the Hudson River has been largely due to music and getting people together and doing things. So I encourage people who play an instrument to actually
continue to do that. So I have a Mean Lids CD here, and part of the reason there is that these people are librarians or what have you, and they play locally. In the Iron Post and they're playing today at WEFT. So let's remind you that there's a WEFT Fest. It won't be huge. It will be mainly friends and relatives, but it is interesting. Last year my sister was here and it attended, and we were able to share, and she was able to share with people who were at that situation. There's an empty building over the way. We had a visual material in that building. So people came along, people talked about honey and things like that. So we're getting near to the end of our time. So let's have you say something that you might, in case I missed asking you for information. Have you got other things you might want to say? Meredith, you work a lot with young children.
Yeah.
And
We do.
you go back down home, and home is like on the Mississippi River, or
Right.
where all those captains came up, and there were places like Grafton and Alton that look over. They weren't on the flatland; they were big houses up on the hill.
Yep, vistas. Yeah, I do work with kids. It's come about largely by default. After having gotten a master's degree in art, one wonders, well, just exactly kind of what Chris had brought up earlier, you know, how do you then apply your energies and also be paid to do it so you can, you know, pay your rent? And so I just happened to get a job working with kids at this art center, a multidisciplinary art center in St. Louis. COCA is its name. And I teach there, and since then, since we've come here, I'm now working at St. John's Lutheran School. I'm their part-time art teacher, and then of course, like you had mentioned, USD, which is adults, and also Parkland, which is adults.
And you also have an exhibit in Minneapolis.
Yeah, back in the summer,
Yes,
right.
that's where Chris has picked up his friends and relatives that came here to work with energy over summer. We hope they'll come back in the
Yep.
future.
Minnesota.
We're out of time. I should put on. Let me see if I can get a CD on here. Oh, that's not color. The music of India has not arrived yet. I think they don't have that. Yes.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for coming, Meredith and Chris.